The old house held air thick with the scent of decay and things long forgotten, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. For decades, the wall had stood, an unbroken stretch of plaster and brick, concealing its terrible secret behind a mask of ordinary home life. Then the pickaxe struck. A sharp, metallic crack echoed through the hollow space. With each deliberate swing, the plaster crumbled away, exposing the rough, uneven brickwork beneath, until a small, dark opening appeared. And from that newly opened mouth, in a faint whisper of dust and ancient air, something small and round tumbled out, landing on the floorboards with a soft, sickening thud. A human skull, bleached by time. Its empty eye sockets stared upward at the men who had dared to disturb its long, silent vigil. Before we move on with the story of Vauclair Plantation, a tale that will send chills down your spine and make you doubt the very foundations of history, take a moment to become part of our community. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and tell us in the comments below which state or city you're listening from. Your support helps us dig up more dark chapters from the past. The packet boat, the Natchez bell ringing, churned down the Mississippi, its paddle wheel letting out a rhythmic sigh against the vast, indifferent current. Arthur Devo, a man whose 41 years had carved lines of quiet determination around his eyes, stood at the railing, watching the lush, oppressive Louisiana landscape unfold. It was late September of 1887, and the air, even out on the river, lay like a thick, humid blanket that stuck to the skin and promised no relief. He was headed for Iberville Parish, a name that carried the taste of history and forgotten sorrows, a place where the past wasn't simply remembered but seemed to breathe, slow and heavy, in the cypress swamps and the crumbling grandeur of its old plantations. Arthur knew the South's peculiar brand of decay well. His own father's once thriving New Orleans mercantile business had collapsed in the chaotic wake of the war, leaving Arthur with a deep-rooted aversion to financial instability and a methodical, almost obsessive way of working. He was a land assessor, a man of ledgers and measurements, hired by the respected New Orleans legal firm of Bowyer and Associates to untangle the thorny inheritance dispute surrounding the Vauclair property. The plantation, a sprawling, once magnificent estate, had sat abandoned since 1865, a silent monument to the sudden end of an era. As the boat neared the landing at Plackham, the air grew even heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and the distant, cloying sweetness of sugarcane. The riverbanks were a tangled mess of cypress and live oak, their branches draped in Spanish moss that hung like mournful shrouds. It was a landscape that felt ancient, primordial, holding secrets far older than any human settlement. A rickety carriage, hired in advance, met him at the muddy landing. The driver, a taciturn man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much Louisiana sun, offered little conversation beyond giving directions. The ride inland was slow, the road little more than a rutted track winding through dense forest. The silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the occasional splash of an alligator in a hidden bayou. Arthur felt a prickle of unease, a sensation he usually dismissed as the overactive imagination of a city man. But here, in this primeval landscape, it felt different, more insistent. When they finally emerged from the tree-line, the Vauclair plantation house appeared, a ghostly vision against the bruised afternoon sky. It was a grand structure, or had been once, its Greek Revival columns now peeling and stained. Some had collapsed entirely, lying like broken bones in the overgrown grass. The paint, once a pristine white, had faded to a sickly yellow, flaking away in large patches to reveal the dark wood beneath. The wide verandas, meant for leisurely afternoons, were choked with vines, their tendrils snaking through the railings and up the walls, reclaiming the house with a slow, relentless embrace. The garden, once meticulously manicured, had become a riot of wild growth. Exotic plants ran rampant, swallowing statues and pathways alike. It was a place where nature had taken over, erasing the careful hand of man. Arthur stepped out of the carriage, and the humid air immediately pressed in on him. The silence here was even deeper than in the forest, a heavy, expectant hush that seemed to hold its breath. He surveyed the scene, his professional eye already calculating the immense task ahead. This wasn't just an assessment. It was an archaeological dig into a forgotten life. He met Thomas Greer, the local laborer he had hired, by the crumbling steps of the main house. Greer was a man of 38, lean and weathered, with a face that seemed carved from the very earth of Iberville Parish. His eyes, a pale, unsettling blue, held a quiet intensity, and his movements were economical, deliberate. He spoke little, answering Arthur's questions with grunts or short, clipped sentences, but his presence felt solid, reassuring in its stoicism. He had already begun the hard work of clearing some of the most aggressive vines from the entrance, his pickaxe glinting in the fading light. 2 days later, Edgar Tate arrived, a stark contrast to Greer's quiet strength. Edgar was only 24, fresh-faced and eager, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He carried a leather-bound field journal already half-filled with careful notes and sketches, and his enthusiasm for the task was nearly tangible. He was Arthur's assistant, a recent graduate from a New Orleans surveying school, and his youthful energy was a welcome, if sometimes overwhelming, counterpoint to Arthur's more reserved manner. Together, they began to explore the house. The interior was a symphony of decay. The air was thick with the smell of rot, river damp, and a faint, lingering scent of something indefinable, something ancient and trapped. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating the ghostly outlines of what had once been a grand home. The floorboards groaned underfoot, each step echoing through the cavernous rooms. In the main parlor, a grand piano stood, its keys warped and yellowed, a silent monument to forgotten melodies. Moth-eaten draperies hung in tatters, framing views of the encroaching wilderness. At night, the sounds of the cypress forest pressed in, a chorus of unseen creatures, frogs, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. The house, stripped of its human inhabitants, seemed to revert to a more primal state, its silence punctuated by the creaks and groans of settling wood and the rustle of unseen things within the walls. Arthur found himself sleeping fitfully, the oppressive atmosphere seeping into his dreams. One evening, while cataloging the contents of the front parlor, Arthur paused before a large oil-painted portrait. It depicted Henri Vauclair, the former owner, a man in his 50s, heavy-jowled, with a stern, unyielding gaze. The portrait, likely painted around 1858, captured a man of considerable presence, his dark eyes seeming to follow Arthur across the room. Arthur stared at it longer than he should have, a strange fascination holding him captive. There was something unsettling in Vauclair's painted eyes, a coldness that went beyond the canvas, a hint of an unyielding will that made Arthur shiver despite the oppressive heat. He felt a deep sense of unease, as if the man in the portrait wasn't merely an image but a silent, watchful presence still presiding over his decaying domain. The days that followed settled into a methodical, almost ritualistic rhythm of inventory. Arthur, with Edgar at his side, moved through the main house like archaeologists, sifting through the ruins of a lost civilization. Each room was a tableau of stopped time, a snapshot of a life suddenly abandoned. They catalogued what remained, broken furniture, its elegant lines hidden by dust and cobwebs, moth-eaten draperies that crumbled at a touch, a grand piano with warped, yellowed keys, its silent chords a testament to forgotten melodies, silver candlesticks tarnished to a deep, almost black patina, standing like sentinels on a mantelpiece, a rack of hunting rifles, their barrels rusted, their stocks gnawed by time and insects. Arthur's meticulous nature found a grim satisfaction in this task. He dictated to Edgar, who with youthful earnestness transcribed every detail into his journal, his pen scratching rhythmically on the thick paper. The process was slow, painstaking, and deeply unsettling. Each object, however mundane, carried the ghost of a touch, a memory, a life that had once filled these now empty spaces. The air itself seemed heavy with these echoes, a palpable sense of lives lived and abruptly ceased. In what had clearly been Vauclair's study, a room dominated by a massive, dust-shrouded desk, Arthur found a collection of Plantation ledgers. Their leather bindings were cracked, their pages brittle and yellowed, but the ink inside remained surprisingly vibrant. He opened one, his fingers tracing the elegant, if somewhat severe, script. It was a record of the plantation's human capital, a chilling testament to the era. Columns of names listed by first name only: Mari, Jean-Luc, Samuel, Adele, Toussaint, Felix, stood beside dollar values, beside tasks assigned, beside dates of acquisition or transfer. Arthur began to read the names aloud, a habit born of his professional need to verify every detail. His voice, usually so steady, faltered as he spoke them, each one a stark reminder of the dehumanizing math of the time. He read Toussaint, then Adele, then Felix, his voice trailing off. He stopped, the ledger heavy in his hands. The sheer brutal simplicity of it, human beings reduced to entries in a financial record, struck him with a force he hadn't expected. He had seen such ledgers before, of course, but never had he been so intimately immersed in the physical space where those lives had been lived, and where they might have ended. Edgar, who had been diligently sketching a broken globe in the corner, looked up, his brow furrowed. He had noticed the sudden silence, the subtle shift in Arthur's posture. "Something wrong, Mr. Devo?" he asked, his voice soft. Arthur shook his head, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "No, Edgar. Just the weight of it all. These names, these lives." He closed the ledger with a soft thud, the sound echoing through the quiet room. He felt a deep discomfort, a moral unease that gnawed at the edges of his professional detachment. This wasn't merely property. It was a grave. As they continued their inventory, they discovered a locked room off the back gallery. It was an anomaly, a space that did not appear on any of the rudimentary floor plans Arthur had been given by Bowyer and Associates. The door, a heavy, unadorned slab of cypress, was secured with a formidable iron lock, rusted solid. They tried to force it, to pick it, but it remained stubbornly shut, a silent, impenetrable barrier. The mystery of it lingered, a small, persistent question mark in Arthur's otherwise orderly assessment. He made a note of it, a brief entry in his own meticulous journal: locked room, rear gallery, not on plans. Access denied. It was Thomas Greer, the taciturn laborer, who first drew Arthur's attention to something even more peculiar. While clearing debris from the exterior walls, he pointed out several sections of the house where brick or plaster filled spaces that, by the logical geometry of the structure, should have been open doorways or even entire rooms. "Old houses, they change 'em a lot," Greer grunted, his pale eyes scanning the wall. "But this here, this ain't just changin'. This is sealin', dot." He indicated a section of the north wall of the main house, where a patch of plaster, though aged, seemed subtly different from the surrounding material. It was a slightly different hue, a finer texture, and the faint outlines of brickwork beneath suggested a more recent, or at least distinct, construction. Arthur, ever the pragmatist, initially dismissed it. Many old houses are modified repeatedly, Thomas, he said, making a note in his assessment book. Rooms added, passages closed off. It's common. But even as he wrote it, a faint, unsettling echo of Greer's observation lingered. The word "Seelin" had a particular resonance in this silent, decaying house, a word that carried a heavier implication than mere modification. It was a detail he filed away, a small, almost invisible seed of unease planted in the fertile ground of the Vauclair estate. The oppressive heat of the Louisiana autumn continued its relentless siege, baking the earth and shimmering off the vast fields of sugarcane that bordered the Vauclair property. One afternoon, Edgar Tate, ever diligent in mapping the estate's sprawling perimeter, found himself at the edge of the cane fields, his spectacles fogged with perspiration. The stalks towered over him, a dense, rustling wall of green, their sharp leaves whispering secrets in the humid breeze. It was there, amidst the rhythmic swish of a machete, that he encountered Levi Dubose. Levi was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 70 years of sun and toil. His skin, the color of rich earth, was stretched taut over prominent cheekbones, and his eyes, though clouded with age, held a deep, knowing intelligence. He was cutting cane on a neighboring plot, his movements slow but deliberate, each swing of the blade a testament to a lifetime of labor. Edgar, with his youthful earnestness, approached cautiously, feeling the weight of history in the old man's presence. "Good afternoon, sir," Edgar offered, his voice a little too bright in the heavy silence. "My name is Edgar Tate. I'm assisting Mr. Devo with the assessment of the Vauclair property." Levi paused, his machete resting against a thick stalk. He looked at Edgar, his gaze unblinking, assessing. He did not immediately reply, merely nodded slowly. There was a profound caution in his demeanor, a weariness born of experience. Edgar, undeterred, continued, "We found the house to be quite a puzzle. It's been abandoned for so long. We were hoping to speak with someone who might remember it in its working years." Levi's gaze shifted from Edgar to the distant, decaying silhouette of the Vauclair mansion, partially hidden by the trees. A flicker of something unreadable, memory, sorrow, perhaps resentment, crossed his face. "That house," he said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly strong for his age, "it remembers more than any man alive." Edgar, sensing a breakthrough, pressed gently. "We'd be grateful for any insights you could offer, Mr. Dubose. Perhaps you could even come onto the property, show us around." Levi shook his head slowly, a firm, almost invisible gesture. "No, young man. I don't step foot on that land. Not anymore. Not for a long, long time." He spoke from the very edge of the property line, a self-imposed boundary he seemed unwilling to cross. His words were measured, deliberate, each one carefully chosen. He began to speak, his voice a low, steady cadence, painting a vivid picture of the Vauclair estate in its prime. He remembered Henri Vauclair as a man who ran his property not with kindness but with an iron fist, his authority absolute, his calculations cold and precise. He was a man who knew the value of everything, Levi recounted, and the worth of no one. Levi spoke of the daily rhythms of the plantation, the back-breaking labor, the constant fear that permeated every corner of the estate. And then, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, he began to speak of 3 people specifically, their names emerging from the depths of his memory like long-lost echoes. "There was Toussaint," Levi began, his eyes distant. "A stonemason, the best in 3 parishes. He could build anything, fix anything. Strong hands, but a quiet spirit. He built many of the walls on that place, the foundations, the chimneys. He knew stone like a man knows his own skin. He paused. And Adele, he continued, Toussaint's wife. She worked in the house. A quiet woman, but with a fire in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She kept things clean, kept things running. She had a way with herbs, too, for healing. Then, and their son, Felix, Levi said, a hint of sorrow entering his voice. 15, maybe 16 years old when the war ended. A good boy, quick with his hands, always learning from his father. He was just coming into his own, full of life, full of questions. Levi paused, his gaze once again fixed on the distant house, as if seeing ghosts dance in the peeling paint. In April of 1865, he resumed, his voice now carrying a chilling certainty, in those last chaotic weeks before the Union forces finally reached this part of Louisiana, Toussaint, Adele, and Felix, they simply ceased to exist. Edgar, who had been scribbling furiously in his journal, stopped, his pen hovering over the page. Ceased to exist, he repeated, a knot forming in his stomach. You mean they escaped? Ran off. Levi shook his head slowly, emphatically. No, young man. Not escaped. Not moved. Ceased. One day they were there, the next they were gone. Vauclair told the other workers they'd run off north, seeking freedom. But I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. His eyes held a fierce, unwavering conviction. They weren't the kind to just disappear without a trace. Toussaint, he was too careful. Adele, too rooted. Felix, too young to just vanish into thin air. A profound silence descended, broken only by the rustling of the cane. Levi's words hung heavy in the humid air, painting a picture of a disappearance far more sinister than a simple escape. He looked at the house again, a long, searching gaze that seemed to pierce through the decay and the years. Toussaint built those walls, Levi said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of an undeniable truth. He knew how they were built. He was the only one who could have sealed them from the inside, or been sealed inside them. Then, without another word, Levi Dubose turned and walked away, back into the dense, whispering cane fields, his machete once again swinging in a slow, rhythmic arc. He did not look back at the house, leaving Edgar Tate standing alone at the property line, the old man's chilling words echoing in his mind, a cold premonition settling deep in his bones. The silence of the Vauclair plantation no longer felt merely empty. It felt pregnant with a terrible, unspoken truth. The words of Levi Dubose had burrowed deep into Arthur Devoe's mind, a persistent, unsettling hum beneath the surface of his methodical work. He tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of an old man, a relic of a bygone era. But the image of Toussaint, the master stonemason, and the chilling implication of walls sealed from the inside refused to dislodge. 3 days after Edgar's encounter with Levi, the weight of those words felt heavier than the humid air itself. Thomas Greer, ever the quiet observer, was meticulously clearing debris from the back service corridor, a narrow, dimly lit passage running along the north wall of the main house. This corridor, designed for the enslaved workers to move unseen, was a forgotten artery of the plantation, choked with decades of fallen plaster, broken timbers, and the detritus of a life abruptly abandoned. It was a place of shadows and echoes, where the very air seemed to hold the memory of hurried footsteps and whispered conversations. As Greer worked, his pickaxe chipping away at stubborn mortar, he noticed something. The plaster on a particular section of the north wall, roughly 12 feet wide, was subtly yet distinctly different from the surrounding material. It wasn't just the discoloration of age. It was a fundamental difference in texture, a slightly smoother finish that spoke of a later application. The color, a muted, almost sickly gray, contrasted with the deeper, more organic tones of the original construction. Even the technique of the bricklaying, visible at one crumbling corner where the plaster had flaked away, seemed to deviate from the meticulous, uniform pattern of the rest of the house. It was newer, yes, but not in the way a simple repair might be. It was meaningfully newer, a deliberate intervention. Greer, whose hands knew the language of brick and mortar better than any book, paused. He ran a calloused palm over the surface, feeling the subtle variations. He tapped it gently with the head of his pickaxe. The sound was duller, less resonant than the solid wall beside it. He called for Arthur. Arthur, who had been reviewing ledgers in the study, arrived, his brow furrowed with a mixture of annoyance at the interruption and a growing sense of foreboding. Greer, with his usual economy of words, simply pointed. "This here," he grunted. "It ain't right." Arthur examined the wall. He saw what Greer saw, but his mind, trained in logic and measurement, sought confirmation. He retrieved his measuring tape and plumb bob. He measured the exterior of the house, then the interior. He consulted the rudimentary floor plans he possessed, comparing them to the physical dimensions. The sealed portion accounted for a space roughly 12 feet wide and 8 feet deep. A room. A room that had no door, no window, no apparent access from any other part of the house. It was a void, a deliberate absence in the architectural blueprint. He marked the location on his floor plan, a stark, unsettling rectangle drawn in red ink. The implications of Levi Dubos's words, dismissed just days before, now resonated with a chilling clarity. Toussaint built those walls. He knew how they were built. He was the only one who could have sealed them from the inside, or been sealed inside them. That night, Arthur returned to his room in the decaying mansion. The sounds of the swamp seemed louder, more insistent, the creaks and groans of the old house more sinister. He did not sleep well. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments, the missing names from the ledger, the locked room off the gallery, Greer's observation about sealed walls, and now the undeniable evidence of a deliberately enclosed space. The portrait of Vauclair in the parlor seemed to watch him, its painted eyes holding a silent, knowing malevolence. By dawn, a decision had solidified in Arthur's mind, cold and unyielding as the morning mist. His professional mandate was to assess the property, and a hidden, undocumented room was a significant structural anomaly. More than that, however, was a burgeoning sense of moral imperative. The weight of those names in the ledger, the chilling implication of Levi's words, the very silence of the house, it all demanded an answer. He found Thomas Greer already at work, sharpening his tools by the light of a lantern. Edgar Tate, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, was preparing coffee over a small fire. Arthur's voice, when he spoke, was low but firm, cutting through the morning stillness. "Thomas," he said, "we're opening that wall." Greer's pale eyes met Arthur's, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. He simply nodded, picked up his heaviest pickaxe, and walked toward the service corridor. Edgar, sensing the gravity of the moment, quickly grabbed his journal and followed, his face pale with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. The first blow of the pickaxe against the plaster was a sharp, resonant crack that echoed through the silent house, a sound of violation. Dust, thick and ancient, billowed into the air, catching the weak morning light filtering through the grimy windows. Greer worked with a grim, methodical efficiency, each swing powerful and precise. The plaster, surprisingly thick, gave way in chunks, revealing the rough, uneven brickwork beneath. The air that began to seep from the newly exposed cracks was stale, heavy, and profoundly wrong, a smell of trap time, of earth and decay, but also something else. Something indefinable and deeply unsettling. As the opening widened, a strange, almost palpable pressure seemed to build in the corridor. The dust, illuminated by the shafts of light, danced like spectral figures. The sounds of the bricks giving way, the scraping of mortar, filled the space, a relentless, grinding symphony of destruction. Edgar stood back, his hand pressed to his mouth, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. Arthur, his jaw clenched, watched with a grim fascination, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Then, with a final resonant crack, a larger section of brickwork gave way. A rush of air, colder and heavier than the humid morning, escaped the newly formed aperture, and from that dark, gaping maw, something tumbled out. It was small, bone-white, and undeniably human. It landed with a soft, sickening thud on the dusty floorboards at Thomas Greer's feet. It was a human hand, or what remained of one, skeletal, brittle, its delicate bones still articulated but clearly ancient. Thomas Greer did not scream. He did not even flinch. He went absolutely still, his pickaxe frozen midair, his pale eyes fixed on the macabre object at his feet. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, broken only by the frantic beating of Arthur's own heart. And in that terrible, suffocating silence, Arthur Devo stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. He peered through the opening into the impenetrable darkness beyond, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light, a darkness that promised unspeakable horrors. The smell that now emanated from the newly opened space was unmistakable, ancient, utterly chilling. It was the smell of death, long buried and now violently disturbed. CTA-2, the wall has been opened, and the first chilling truth has been revealed. What do you think happened inside that room? What secrets do you believe are still waiting to be uncovered? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if this story has you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to show your support for Liturgy of Fear. Every like helps us bring more forgotten histories to light. The darkness beyond the newly breached wall was absolute, a void that seemed to absorb the weak light filtering into the service corridor. Arthur Devo, his heart hammering against his ribs, retrieved a lantern from Edgar, its flickering flame pushing back the shadows with hesitant courage. He held it aloft, his hand trembling slightly, and peered into the abyss. What the lantern light revealed was a scene frozen in time, a tableau of unimaginable horror. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet by 8, and the air within was thick, heavy with the stench of decay, dust, and something else, a cloying, sweet odor that spoke of long-contained organic matter. It was a smell that would forever be etched into Arthur's memory, a scent of profound, ancient death. On the floor, amidst a scattering of debris and fine, ancient dust, lay the skeletal remains of 3 individuals. The bones were disarticulated in places, but their general arrangement suggested 2 adults and 1 younger person. They were not neatly arranged, not respectfully interred. Their positions were contorted, suggestive of a desperate struggle or perhaps a slow, agonizing surrender. One set of remains lay huddled in a corner as if seeking refuge, while another sprawled near what appeared to be a collapsed wooden crate. The third, smaller skeleton lay between them, a silent, heartbreaking testament to a life cut tragically short. Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him, a visceral reaction to the undeniable truth laid bare before his eyes. These were not merely bones. These were the remnants of lives, brutally extinguished and deliberately hidden. Thomas Greer stood behind him, silent and unmoving, his face a mask of grim understanding. Edgar Tate, his youthful enthusiasm replaced by profound shock, had retreated a few steps, his hands still clamped over his mouth, his eyes wide and glistening behind his spectacles. The room itself was not empty. It was a tomb, yes, but also a repository of poignant, heartbreaking relics. The wooden crate, partially collapsed under the weight of time and perhaps the desperate movements of its former occupants, lay near the center. Arthur, forcing himself to move, to examine, to document, carefully approached it. Inside, nestled amongst the splintered wood and dust, were a few objects that had miraculously survived the decades of confinement. He reached in, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It was a small tin box, no larger than a man's hand, sealed tightly with what appeared to be ancient, hardened wax. Its surface was tarnished, but its integrity seemed intact. This, he knew instinctively, was important. This was a message from the past, a whisper from the grave. Beside the box, half buried in the dust, he found a woman's comb, intricately carved from tortoiseshell, its teeth still remarkably preserved. It was an object of simple beauty, a personal item that spoke of vanity, of care, of a life lived. And then, a child's shoe, small and worn, its leather cracked and brittle but undeniably a child's. It lay on its side as if kicked off in haste, a poignant symbol of lost innocence. Finally, he carefully uncovered a folded piece of cloth, its fabric faded and fragile, but with the faint outline of something embroidered upon it. He dared not unfold it then, fearing it would disintegrate. Arthur carefully gathered these artifacts, placing them gently into a canvas bag he carried for samples. Each item felt impossibly heavy, laden with the unspoken stories of the dead. He did not know yet what any of it meant, but he knew with a chilling certainty that these were not random objects. They were clues, fragments of a narrative waiting to be pieced together. He sent Edgar to Plackham with an urgent message for Dr. Auguste Prévost, the Iberville parish coroner. The message was brief, stark: human remains discovered. Vauclair Plantation. Immediate attendance required. He also dispatched a letter to Bowyer and Associates in New Orleans, his usual dry, factual tone replaced by a more somber, urgent prose. The nature of the assessment, he wrote, has fundamentally changed. This is no longer merely about property value. It is about a crime, a profound injustice that demands investigation. While they awaited Prévost's arrival, the house seemed to settle into a new, heavier silence. The discovery had irrevocably altered its atmosphere. The decay no longer felt merely natural, it felt complicit. Arthur found himself drawn back to the front parlor, to the portrait of Henri Vauclair. He stood before it, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows across the heavy-jowled face. He stared at the painted eyes, searching for an answer, a flicker of recognition, a hint of the monstrous cruelty that must have resided within the man. It was then, in the direct afternoon light that streamed through the grimy windows, that Arthur noticed it, a thin, almost invisible cut, a diagonal line across Vauclair's painted face, running from the left temple down to the right cheekbone. It was so skillfully repaired, so meticulously varnished over, that it was almost imperceptible in anything but the most direct light. It was a deliberate act of defacement made long ago, a silent act of rebellion or vengeance against the men whose image now presided over a house of horrors. The slash was a wound, a secret scar on the face of the absent villain. And Arthur wondered who had made it, and why. The house, he realized, held more than just bones. It held layers of secrets, each one more disturbing than the last. 3 days later, Dr. Auguste Prévost arrived from Plackham, his carriage rattling down the overgrown drive, a starkly modern intrusion into the ancient silence of the Vauclair plantation. He was a man of precise habits and formal demeanor, his dark suit immaculate despite the dust of the journey, his spectacles perched on a thin nose. Prévost was a medical man, trained in the burgeoning science of forensic pathology, but even his professional detachment seemed strained by the grim task that awaited him. He carried a leather satchel filled with instruments and notebooks, a silent testament to the methodical nature of his work. Arthur met him at the front door, the oppressive heat doing little to ease the tension in the air. He led Prévost directly to the service corridor, where the gaping hole in the wall now stood as a stark monument to the horrors within. The air in the corridor, though somewhat aired out, still carried the faint, cloying scent of the sealed room, a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the house. Dr. Prévost, after a brief, assessing glance at the opening, donned a pair of thin leather gloves. He entered the small, confined space with a cautious, almost reverent step, his lantern casting a clinical light over the skeletal remains. He worked with a quiet intensity, his movements deliberate and precise. He examined each bone, each fragment, noting its position, its condition, its relation to the others. He spoke little, occasionally dictating observations to Edgar, who, though still pale, diligently recorded every word in his journal. His official report, which Arthur later read in full, was a masterpiece of measured scientific prose, devoid of emotion, yet chilling in its implications. 3 individuals, Prévost had written, his script neat and precise. 2 adults, consistent with male and female, estimated ages 40 to 50 years and 30 to 40 years respectively. 1 adolescent, estimated age 15 to 17 years, sex indeterminate. He noted the absence of any evidence of disease or prior injury that might have contributed to their demise. The most damning observations, however, concerned the positioning of the remains, the configuration of the skeletal elements. Prévost's report continued, particularly the flexion of the limbs and the proximity of the individuals is consistent with prolonged confinement within a restricted space. There is no indication of post-mortem placement. The evidence strongly suggests that the room was sealed while its occupants were still alive. He used the word confinement carefully, a euphemism for a terror that defied clinical description. He detailed the faint scratch marks on the interior brickwork, the desperate, futile attempts to escape, the final huddled positions. Prévost filed his report with the Iberville Parish Office, a bureaucratic formality in a world that often ignored the suffering of those deemed less than human. No one came to collect it. No investigation was opened. This was 1887 Louisiana, a society still grappling with the seismic shifts of Reconstruction, where the lives of formerly enslaved people, even in death, held little official weight. The 3 people in that wall had no official names, no records, no legal status that survived the war. They were, in the eyes of the law, still property, and property could not be murdered. Arthur was furious. A cold, righteous anger, unfamiliar in its intensity, simmered beneath his usually composed exterior. He had expected, perhaps naively, that the discovery of such a heinous crime would ignite some spark of justice, some official inquiry. Instead, he was met with a wall of bureaucratic indifference, a chilling echo of the very wall he had just breached. He was also, for the first time, genuinely afraid. Not of ghosts, not of the supernatural, but of the profound, crushing weight of what he was holding. He held the truth of a monstrous act, a truth that society seemed determined to ignore. He could not walk away from this and simply write a property assessment. His methodical mind, once focused solely on ledgers and measurements, now found itself consumed by a different kind of calculation, the calculus of injustice. Without being asked by Bowyer and Associates, Without any official mandate, Arthur Devo began to investigate. His assessment of the Vauclair property had transformed into something far more profound, a reluctant quest for truth in a world that preferred to keep its darkest secrets buried. He knew with a chilling certainty that the bones in that wall were not just a historical curiosity. They were a demand, a silent scream for recognition and justice that had echoed for 22 years, and which he, Arthur Devo, was now compelled to answer. The bureaucratic indifference of the parish office had left Arthur with a bitter taste in his mouth, a profound sense of frustration that gnawed at his methodical nature. He understood the societal currents of 1887 Louisiana, the lingering shadows of a system that had denied humanity to so many. But understanding did not quell the burning injustice he felt. He needed records, something tangible, something that could give names and context to the silent victims in the wall. His inquiries at the parish clerk's office, though met with polite stonewalling, yielded one crucial piece of information. The clerk, a portly man named Mr. Thibodeau, had mentioned almost as an afterthought that if anyone would have records pertaining to the old plantations, it would be the Fontenaux. Old Remy Fontenot, Thibodeau had mused, he was the notary for half the parish back before the war. Kept everything. His daughter Nora, she's the schoolteacher now, probably still has all his papers. Arthur seized upon this lead with renewed purpose. He made the short journey to Plackham, a bustling river town that, despite its proximity to the decaying grandeur of Vauclair, felt vibrant and alive. The schoolhouse was a modest clapboard building, its windows bright with the afternoon sun, the sounds of children's voices drifting from within. Nora Fontenot was not what Arthur expected. He had envisioned a stern, elderly spinster, perhaps a bit dusty herself, like the records she might possess. Instead, he found a woman in her late 30s, her dark hair neatly pinned, her eyes intelligent and direct. She possessed a quiet strength, an air of thoughtful composure that immediately commanded his respect. She listened patiently as Arthur, choosing his words carefully, explained the grim discovery at Vauclair and his need to consult her late father's notarial records. Nora's face, initially composed, tightened slightly as he spoke of the sealed room and the bones. Her father, Remy Fontenot, had been a man of meticulous habits, a pillar of the community who had handled the legal affairs of Iberville Parish from 1848 until his death in 1879. She knew intimately the kind of men her father had dealt with, and the kind of secrets they often kept. She spoke of Henri Vauclair in a particular tone, the tone of a daughter who had heard her father speak of someone he disliked intensely but could not, for professional reasons, refuse. "My father kept everything," Nora confirmed, her voice soft but firm. "He believed in the power of the written word, for good or ill. All his papers are stored in trunks in the after-hours room here at the schoolhouse. I use them sometimes for local history lessons, though not the darker parts." She led him to a small, cluttered room at the back of the school, filled with stacks of old textbooks, maps, and indeed several large leather-bound trunks. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Over the next 3 evenings, after the last of the children had gone home and the schoolhouse fell silent, Arthur and Nora embarked on a painstaking journey through 30 years of Remy Fontenot's notarial records. They worked by the flickering light of oil lamps, their shadows dancing on the walls. Nora, with an almost uncanny memory for her father's filing system, guided Arthur through the labyrinth of documents. She had inherited her father's meticulousness, and her quiet brilliance shone through as she navigated the complex legal language of the era. Arthur, usually so self-reliant, found himself relying on her insights, her knowledge of local families and their intricate histories. They sifted through land deeds, bills of sale, marriage contracts, wills, and countless other documents that painted a vivid, if often unsettling, picture of life in antebellum and post-Reconstruction Louisiana. The hours melted away, punctuated only by the rustle of turning pages and the occasional whispered comment. Then, on the third evening, as the moon cast long shadows through the schoolhouse windows, Nora found it. Her fingers, delicate yet firm, paused on a particular document, its paper yellowed and brittle. "Here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is unusual." It was dated March 1865, a mere 6 weeks before Vauclair's disappearance and the final chaotic collapse of Confederate authority in Louisiana. It was a notarized document, bearing Remy Fontenot's distinctive signature and seal, in which Henri Vauclair transferred ownership of 3 specific enslaved persons, Toussaint, Adele, and a minor identified as Felix, to a business entity in New Orleans called the Dufresne Mercantile Trust. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The names, the very names Levi Dubose had spoken, the names Arthur had read in Vauclair's ledger, now appeared on a legal document, their humanity reduced to a transaction. But it was the transfer price that truly made his blood run cold. Listed plainly, in bold script, was the sum of $1. $1 for 3 human beings. Nora read the document twice, her eyes scanning every word as if hoping to find some mitigating clause, some hidden meaning. Then, very carefully, she set it down on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Her gaze met Arthur's, and in her eyes he saw a profound understanding, a dawning horror that mirrored his own. The implications were staggering. This was not a sale for profit. This was something far more sinister, a transaction designed not for economic gain but for control, for erasure, for a final, brutal act of dehumanization. The silence in the schoolhouse was no longer merely peaceful. It was heavy with the weight of a terrible, undeniable truth. CTA 3, just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror inside Vauclair Plantation only deepens. The discovery of this document changes everything, revealing a chilling motive behind the unspeakable acts. If this story is giving you chills and you're eager to uncover the full truth, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. As Arthur Deveau delved deeper into the heart of New Orleans, the humid, oppressive air of Iberville Parish gave way to the bustling, cacophonous energy of the city. But New Orleans in October of 1887 was in the grip of its own peculiar dread. A yellow fever scare had swept through the city, leaving a palpable tension in its wake. The streets near the river, usually vibrant with commerce and conversation, now carried the acrid scent of burning sulfur from the fumigation bonfires, a desperate attempt to ward off the invisible killer. Arthur Deveau, accompanied by a still somber Edgar Tate, moved through this anxious atmosphere, his mind singularly focused on the paper trail that led from the Vauclair plantation to the heart of the city. Their first objective was the Dufresne Mercantile Trust, the mysterious entity to which Toussaint, Adele, and Felix had been sold for $1. The city, despite its anxieties, was a labyrinth of commerce and bureaucracy, and Arthur, with his methodical approach, began to navigate its complexities. He and Edgar spent days sifting through old city directories, consulting legal archives, and making inquiries at various financial institutions. The trail, however, kept doubling back on itself, obscured by time and deliberate obfuscation. They eventually discovered that the Dufresne Mercantile Trust had dissolved in 1866, conveniently just 1 year after the war's end and Vauclair's disappearance. Its records, they were told, had been absorbed into a larger, more prominent firm, Charbonnet and Sons, a venerable institution that still operated from a grand columned building on Canal Street. Arthur, dressed in his finest suit, called upon Charbonnet and Sons. He was received by a polite, impeccably dressed clerk, whose smooth demeanor belied a subtle, almost imperceptible air of condescension. Arthur explained his purpose, requesting access to the Dufresne records from 1865. The clerk listened patiently, his hands clasped before him. "Ah, the Dufresne Trust," the clerk said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "A rather unfortunate chapter in the city's commercial history. I'm afraid, Mr. Devoe, those particular records are quite unavailable. A most regrettable incident, you see, the Great Flood of 1867. Extensive water damage. Many of the older documents, particularly those from the immediate post-war period, were utterly destroyed." He offered a sympathetic shrug, his eyes, however, remaining cool and unyielding. Arthur did not believe him. The story was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with the pattern of erasure he was beginning to uncover. He thanked the clerk, his voice betraying none of his frustration, and left Charbonnet and Sons, the scent of sulfur and unspoken secrets clinging to him. His next target was Clarence Noel, listed in Vauclair's ledgers as the plantation's primary cotton broker. If anyone in New Orleans knew Vauclair's true financial dealings and his associates, it would be Noel. Arthur found him through a different route, consulting the directory of retired cotton brokers maintained by the New Orleans Board of Trade. Clarence Noel, it turned out, was still alive, a man of 74, living in a stately, if somewhat faded, house on Esplanade Avenue with his daughter. Arthur called on him, accompanied by Edgar. The house, with its wrought iron balcony and overgrown courtyard, spoke of a past grandeur. Noel, a frail but sharp-eyed man, received them in his parlor, a room filled with heavy, dark furniture and the faint scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. He sat in a high-backed armchair, his hands resting on a cane, his gaze surprisingly keen. Noel listened to Arthur's carefully worded explanation, his expression unreadable. When Arthur finally mentioned Henri Vauclair, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps unease, crossed the old man's face. Noel spoke carefully, precisely, his voice thin but steady, like a man who had rehearsed for decades what he would and would not say. He confirmed that the Dufresne transfer was real. Vauclair was in deep trouble, Mr. Devoe, Noel explained, his eyes fixed on a distant point. The war. It ruined many planters. He owed money to everyone. The Dufresne Trust was one of his largest creditors. They were ruthless. They wanted their pound of flesh, even if it was in human form. He paused, a shadow passing over his face. The transfer was a way to settle a portion of his debt, to prevent total ruin. A desperate measure. And then Noel said something that Arthur had not expected, something that sent a chill down his spine despite the oppressive heat of the room. Vauclair never left Louisiana, Mr. Devoe, Noel stated, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. He did not flee north, as the rumor held. He died. Arthur and Edgar exchanged a stunned glance. Died. Arthur repeated, his voice incredulous. But the official story was that he vanished, that he escaped his debts. Noel shook his head slowly. A convenient story for many. His body was found in a drainage canal outside Plackham in May of 1865. 6 weeks after, 6 weeks after the war ended. A single, clean wound. The case was never officially investigated. The coroner at the time ruled it an accident. A fall, they said. But I knew Henri. He was many things, but clumsy was not one of them. Clarence Noel paused, his gaze now fixed directly on Arthur, his eyes holding a profound, unsettling knowledge. "Whoever sealed those 3 people into that wall, Mr. Devo," he said, his voice barely audible, "someone knew what had been done. And someone, it seems, decided that Henri Vauclair should not live to tell the tale." The implication hung heavy in the air, a new layer of darkness added to the already grim narrative. The mystery of the Vauclair plantation was not merely about a hidden room. It was about a web of secrets, betrayals, and a final, brutal act of vengeance that had been buried for over 2 decades. The journey back to Iberville Parish felt heavier, laden with the new, unsettling knowledge gleaned from Clarence Noel. The image of Henri Vauclair, not as a vanished villain but as a murdered man, added a chilling layer of complexity to the already grim narrative. But the most pressing mystery remained the tin box, the small, sealed container found amidst the bones, a silent messenger from the grave. Back in the relative quiet of the Vauclair mansion, Arthur finally prepared to open it. He laid the box on the large, dust-covered desk in Vauclair's study, the same desk where the ledgers of human lives had been recorded. Edgar stood beside him, his breath held in anticipation, while Thomas Greer, ever present but silent, watched from the doorway. Arthur carefully examined the wax seal. It was old, brittle, but still intact, a testament to the box's long confinement. With a delicate hand, he used a small, sharp knife to break the seal, the ancient wax crumbling with a soft crackle. The lid, stiff with age, resisted for a moment, then yielded with a faint pop, releasing a puff of stale, ancient air. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling fabric, was a single folded letter. Its paper was yellowed and fragile, its edges softened by time, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. Arthur carefully, almost reverently, lifted it out. The paper felt impossibly delicate in his hands, as if it might disintegrate at a touch. He unfolded it with extreme care, revealing a script that was surprisingly elegant, a careful, educated hand. It was not the rough, unlettered scrawl one might expect from an enslaved man. This was someone who had been taught to write formally, perhaps by a sympathetic owner, a church school, or through clandestine lessons. The letter was addressed to no one, and it bore no signature. But the voice that emerged from its faded lines was unmistakably Toussaint's. It began without preamble, a direct, urgent account of what had happened to them and why they were in that room. Toussaint wrote of the chaos of March and April 1865, as the Confederacy crumbled and the promise of freedom, once a distant dream, now seemed tantalizingly close. He spoke of Vauclair's growing desperation, his frantic attempts to salvage what he could from the wreckage of his empire. Master Vauclair, the letter read, his words imbued with a quiet dignity, he received word that his debts to the Dufresne Trust would be collected, not in coin, but in flesh. In us, myself, Adele, and our Felix. We were to be transferred south to a sugar plantation in Terrebonne Parish, a place of harder labor, deeper south, further from the Union lines. This was not freedom. This was a different kind of captivity, a final, cruel twist of the knife. Just as the dawn was breaking, Toussaint's words painted a vivid picture of their desperate choice. He had refused. He could not allow his family to be dragged further into the abyss of slavery, not when freedom was so close. He had known the house, known its hidden spaces, its secret passages. He had built many of them himself. He had found a small, unused storage room, a space off the service corridor, and had provisioned it with what little food and water they could gather, hoping to hide there for a few days, perhaps a week, until the Union forces arrived and the plantation was liberated. We went in willingly, Toussaint's letter continued, his words now imbued with a heartbreaking poignancy. We thought it was for a short time, a hiding place, a refuge until the blue coats came. We heard the sounds of the war, the distant cannons, the rumors of Master Lee's surrender. We thought freedom was at hand. He wrote of Adele's quiet courage, of Felix's youthful fear, of their shared hope in the cramped, dark space. He mentioned a specific date, April 9, 1865, the very day Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, though Toussaint, sealed within his tomb, could not have known the profound significance of that date. Then the letter abruptly shifted, the careful script becoming slightly more hurried. The sounds changed, not the sounds of war, but of construction. Of brick and mortar. We heard the scraping, the mixing. We heard the tapping. We called out. We beat on the walls, but the sounds continued. They were sealing us in, not from the inside, as I had planned to seal us out, but from the outside. Someone was building a wall. A final, cruel wall. The ink on the page seemed to darken, the pressure of the pen increasing, as if Toussaint's hand had trembled with growing terror. We tried to break it. "Felix," he cried. "Adele," she prayed. I knew then. Master Vauclair, he would rather us die here in the dark than be free. He would rather us be nothing than be someone else's property, or our own. The letter ended mid-sentence, abruptly, chillingly. The final words were a fragmented thought, a desperate plea, the ink trailing off into a faint, almost invisible smudge. It was as if the pen had fallen from his hand, or the light had failed, or the very act of writing had been interrupted by the encroaching darkness, by the final, suffocating reality of the sealed tomb. Arthur finished reading, his hands shaking. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. Edgar was openly weeping, tears streaming down his face. Thomas Greer, his face grim, stared at the wall, a profound sorrow etched into his weathered features. The letter was not just a document. It was a voice, a testament, a final, desperate cry from the grave, revealing a betrayal so profound, so utterly devoid of humanity, that it defied comprehension. Toussaint, Adele, and Felix had not been murdered in a fit of rage. They had been deliberately, coldly, calculatedly immured, their lives extinguished by the very men who had once claimed ownership of them, all to prevent their freedom. The letter from the tin box had laid bare the motive, the agonizing choice, and the horrific fate of Toussaint, Adele, and Felix. But one crucial question remained, a chilling echo in the silent house. Who had sealed the wall? Toussaint's words had been clear, someone was building a wall from the outside. Henri Vauclair, for all his cruelty, was not a stonemason. The work Greer had described, the meticulous bricklaying, required significant expertise, and the only person on the property with that skill was Toussaint himself. Arthur returned to Levi Dubose, the old man who carried the living memory of the Vauclair estate. He found Levi in his small, humble cabin, nestled on the edge of the cane fields, a place that felt miles away from the decaying grandeur of the plantation. Arthur laid the fragile letter on Levi's worn wooden table, its faded script a stark contrast to the rough-hewn simplicity of the room. Levi read it slowly, his ancient eyes tracing each word, his lips moving silently. When he finished, he closed his eyes, a profound sorrow settling over his face. He remained silent for a long time, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets and the rustle of the cane. Arthur waited, sensing that Levi was sifting through decades of suppressed memories, weighing the burden of a truth he had carried alone for far too long. Finally, Levi opened his eyes, their gaze clear and steady. "There was another man," he began, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, "on the property in April of '65. A man named Dufresne. Master Vauclair, he brought him in from Baton Rouge. Just for those last few weeks. A rough man, with hands like a bricklayer's, but eyes that held no kindness. No ties to the community, no history with us. Just appeared. Levi paused, his gaze distant, as if watching the events unfold again in his mind. Dufresne said he was the one doing the work on that wall. Toussaint, he was already gone, or so we were told. But Dufresne, he was there working day and night, mixing mortar, laying brick. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Dufresne was gone. Vanished. No one knew where. Vauclair, he just said the man had finished his work and left. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture of calculated, deliberate evil. And you saw Vauclair and Dufresne together? Arthur pressed, his voice barely audible. Levi nodded slowly. 2 nights before that wall was finished, I saw them in the stable, arguing violently. Vauclair, he was shouting, his face red. Dufresne, he was just listening, his face like stone. I was hiding, you see, I shouldn't have been there, but I heard it. I heard Vauclair say something that made no sense at the time. He said, "They stay in there until I say otherwise." I thought he meant the horses, or some supplies. I told myself it meant something else. I had to, because the other meaning, it was too terrible to hold. The confession hung heavy in the air, a testament to the psychological burden Levi had carried for 22 years. He had witnessed the prelude to a monstrous act, and the true meaning of those words had only become clear with the discovery of the sealed room. Arthur looked at Levi, his heart aching with the weight of the old man's suffering. "Why, Levi?" he asked, his voice soft. "Why did you never tell anyone, all these years?" Levi Dubose met his gaze, his eyes holding the profound, weary patience of a man who had watched a great deal of history from its brutal edges. "Who was there to tell, Mr. Devoe?" he asked, his voice devoid of bitterness, merely stating a stark, undeniable truth. "Who would have listened, in 1865, or 1875, or even last year? They were just property. And Master Vauclair, he was a powerful man. A dead man now, but his shadow still long. Who would have believed an old field hand against the word of a planter, even a ruined one?" Arthur had no answer. The question hung in the air, a damning indictment of a society that had systematically silenced the voices of the oppressed, that had rendered their suffering invisible, their lives disposable. The truth, he realized, had been there all along, whispered in the cane fields, carried in the memories of men like Levi Dubose. But the world had simply refused to listen. The wall that had sealed Toussaint, Adele, and Felix was not merely made of brick and mortar. It was made of indifference, of systemic injustice, and of a profound, dehumanizing silence. With Levi Dubose's testimony, the final, horrifying pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a complete, chilling picture of the events that had transpired in April 1865. Arthur Devoe, sitting in the quiet of Vauclair's study, meticulously reconstructed the sequence, his methodical mind now grappling with a calculus of cruelty that defied all reason yet was terrifyingly logical within the context of its time. Henri Vauclair, facing the imminent collapse of the Confederacy and the liquidation of his vast debts by the ruthless Dufresne Mercantile Trust, had made a choice. If he could not keep Toussaint, Adele, and Felix as his property, if they were to be transferred to another master, or worse, if they were to walk free with the Union victory, he would ensure they could not be free at all. Their value, in his twisted logic, lay not in their labor or their lives but in their absolute subjugation, even in death. Toussaint, with his intimate knowledge of the house's construction, had gone into the small, hidden room voluntarily, seeking refuge for his family from the impending transfer, hoping to emerge into a world of freedom. He had provisioned the space, believing it to be a temporary sanctuary. But Vauclair, or Dufresne, under Vauclair's direct and malevolent instruction, had sealed the wall after them. Not from fear, not in a moment of panicked rage, but from a cold, deliberate calculation, from the specific, chilling logic of a man who believed that his human property dying in a wall was preferable to it walking free, to it becoming a testament to his own ruin. This was not an isolated act of madness, Arthur realized with a profound sense of dread. This was an act with legal cover, sanctioned by the very system that had defined human beings as chattel. It was driven by economic motivation, the desire to spite his creditors, to deny them even the meager satisfaction of claiming his most valuable assets. And it was rooted in a deep-seated social precedent, a pervasive belief in the absolute power of a master over his enslaved, a power that extended even to the right to extinguish their lives rather than concede their freedom. The horror of it was not merely the act itself but the system that made it possible, that rendered it, in the eyes of many, not a crime but a regrettable, perhaps even understandable, consequence of a planter's desperation. It was possible because Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix were not seen as people but as property, and property could be disposed of as its owner saw fit. Arthur spent days drafting his final report to Bowyer and Associates. It was no longer a simple property assessment. It was a searing indictment, a detailed account of the discovery, the forensic findings, Levi Dubos's testimony, Nora Fontenot's notarial records, and Clarence Noel's chilling revelations. He included Toussaint's letter, transcribed with meticulous care, its words a haunting testament to the human cost of such cruelty. He laid bare the calculus of Vauclair's actions, the deliberate, cold-blooded decision to entomb 3 living souls. He submitted the report, a thick, heavy document that felt like a physical burden. Bowyer and Associates received it. They filed it. And then, nothing. No legal action followed, because there was no legal mechanism in 1887 Louisiana to pursue it. The victims were black, formerly enslaved, and the perpetrator, Henri Vauclair, was dead, his own murder conveniently ruled an accident. The system, designed to protect property and privilege, had no framework for justice in such a case. Arthur felt a profound disillusionment, a bitter taste in his mouth. He had pursued the truth, uncovered a monstrous crime, and yet the legal system he served, the very foundation of his professional life, was powerless, or unwilling, to act. The silence that had surrounded the Vauclair plantation for 22 years now seemed to extend like a suffocating shroud over the very institutions of justice. He had found the bones. He had found the names. He had found the story. But the world, it seemed, was not yet ready to truly listen. The legal silence that followed Arthur's comprehensive report was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder of the deep-seated inequities that still permeated Louisiana society. But if the official channels were unwilling to act, there were other avenues, other voices that refused to be silenced. Nora Fontenot, the quiet schoolteacher with her father's meticulous records and her own fierce sense of justice, proved to be one such voice. Arthur had shared the full extent of his findings with Nora, including the devastating contents of Toussaint's letter and the chilling revelations from Clarence Noel. Her initial shock had hardened into a quiet, unyielding resolve. She understood the systemic barriers, the ingrained prejudices that would prevent any official investigation. But she also understood the power of truth, of bearing witness. Without consulting Arthur, without seeking permission from anyone, Nora Fontenot made a decision that would ripple quietly through the stagnant waters of Iberville Parish. She spent several nights in the schoolhouse, meticulously copying every document related to the Vauclair estate from her father's archives, the transfer document for Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix, the debt records that detailed Vauclair's financial ruin, and even the marginal notes in Remy Fontenot's careful hand, which sometimes hinted at the deeper, unspoken truths behind the legal formalities. She bundled these copies, along with a concise, impassioned letter of her own, and sent them to the New Orleans Daily Picayune. Her target was a reporter named Claude Arsenault, a man known for his tenacious coverage of the inequities and injustices that plagued Louisiana's post-Reconstruction legal system. Nora knew that if anyone would dare to publish such a story, it would be Arsenault. It was a bold, defiant act, a quiet rebellion against the prevailing silence. But Nora's commitment to justice did not end there. She also composed a formal letter in her own name, addressed to the Iberville Parish Records Office. In it, she respectfully but firmly requested that the death records for Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix be officially entered into the parish register. It was a simple request, yet profoundly revolutionary in its implications. It was a demand for recognition, for the acknowledgement of their humanity, even in death. The parish clerk, Mr. Thibodeau, initially refused. He cited a litany of bureaucratic obstacles, the lack of official documentation, the absence of a formal investigation, the passage of time. "These are not matters for the parish register, Miss Fontenot," he had said, his voice tinged with dismissive impatience. "These are old stories." Nora, however, was not easily deterred. She returned to the clerk's office the next day, and the day after that. Each time, she presented her request with unwavering politeness but with an underlying current of steel. On her third visit, she brought Arthur Deveau with her. Arthur, though weary from his own battles with official indifference, stood silently beside her, his presence lending an undeniable weight to her request. His reputation, his connection to a prominent New Orleans legal firm, was a silent but powerful endorsement. Faced with Nora's quiet persistence and Arthur's formidable presence, Mr. Thibodeau finally relented. With a sigh of exasperation, he retrieved the large leather-bound death register. On November 14, 1887, in a small, cramped office in Placum, 3 names were officially entered into the death register of Iberville Parish. The clerk, however, insisted on one final, chilling compromise. He listed their surnames as Vauclair. "It is the custom, Miss Fontenot," he had stated, his voice firm, "for those who lived on a plantation to bear the planter's name in official records, especially in such unusual circumstances." Nora protested, her voice tight with indignation, but she knew it was a battle she could not win. It was a final, insidious act of the old system, a lingering assertion of ownership even in the face of death. So the entries read, Toussaint Vauclair, Adèle Vauclair, and Felix Vauclair. Their cause of death was listed in the careful, bureaucratic language of the era as sealed enclosure, 1865. It was a cold, clinical description, devoid of the horror and the humanity of their story. But it was there. It was in the official record. It was the most the system would give them, a small, hard-won victory in a long, silent war for recognition. Nora Fontenot, with Arthur Deveau standing silently beside her, had ensured that their names, at least, would not be entirely forgotten. The small, solemn procession moved slowly through the crisp November air, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat that had defined Arthur's arrival. The bones of Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix, carefully gathered and placed in 3 simple wooden coffins, were carried to the churchyard of St. Philippe's Parish Church in Placum. It was a quiet, unassuming burial, devoid of pomp or ceremony, yet imbued with a profound, almost sacred dignity. The churchyard itself was a microcosm of the societal divisions that still scarred Louisiana. The main section, with its ornate headstones and carefully tended plots, was reserved for white parishioners, a silent testament to the enduring racial hierarchy. But adjacent to it, separated by a low, crumbling stone wall, lay the free black burial ground, a more humble space marked by simple wooden crosses and unmarked mounds, the final resting place of generations who had lived and died on the margins of official history. It was here, in this sacred yet segregated ground, that Toussaint, Adele, and Felix were finally laid to rest. Only a handful of people attended. Arthur Devo stood at a respectful distance, near the iron fence that separated the two sections of the cemetery, his hat held over his heart. Edgar Tate, his face solemn, meticulously recorded every detail in his field journal, his pen scratching softly on the paper, preserving the moment for posterity. Thomas Greer, his head bowed, stood beside them, his presence a silent, powerful acknowledgment of the lives lost. But it was Levi Dubose who stood closest to the graves, his ancient frame surprisingly erect. He was the only one there who could say their names with the weight of personal memory, who had known them not as entries in a ledger but as living, breathing human beings. His voice, though raspy with age, carried a profound resonance as he spoke, his words cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. "Toussaint," he said, his voice a low, reverent murmur. "My brother. A stonemason. A good man." He paused. "Adele," he continued, his gaze fixed on the freshly dug earth. "His wife. A kind spirit. A healer." Then, Felix, his voice trembling slightly. "Their son. A boy full of promise. Gone too soon." He did not say anything else. There was no need. His words, simple and heartfelt, carried the full weight of their humanity, their lives, their brutal end, and the long, silent years of their absence. He was their last living witness, their final voice. The priest, a young French Creole man named Père Sylvain Berard, performed the rite without comment, without qualification. He spoke the ancient words of the sacrament, his voice clear and resonant, offering solace and dignity to the departed. He did not preach of vengeance or justice but of peace and remembrance, of the eternal soul. He treated their burial with the same solemnity and respect he would afford any other parishioner, a quiet act of defiance against the prevailing indifference. Arthur watched, a profound sense of quietude settling over him. He thought about his father's ledgers, about the names in Vauclair's columns, about the dollar values assigned to people, about the systemic dehumanization that had made such a crime possible. He thought about the long, arduous journey he had undertaken, from a detached assessor to a reluctant investigator, to a witness to this quiet act of remembrance. He did not have a single, neat thought that resolved itself into a comforting conclusion. There was no easy answer, no simple resolution to the profound injustice he had uncovered. He simply stood there in the cool November air and let the full, crushing weight of it rest on him, a silent testament to the enduring power of human cruelty and the quiet resilience of those who refuse to forget. The earth finally received its own, and the silence of the cemetery held a new, more peaceful, yet still profoundly sorrowful resonance. The article appeared in the New Orleans Daily Picayune on December 3, 1887. It was not on the front page, where headlines screamed of political scandals and economic anxieties. It was buried on page 7, nestled below a large, ornate advertisement for a hardware store on Magazine Street, promising the finest tools and implements for the modern home. Its placement was a subtle yet potent commentary on the value society placed on such a story. But it was there. Claude Arsenault, the tenacious reporter Nora Fontenot had entrusted with her father's records, had done his work. The article, though constrained by the editorial sensibilities of the time, was a stark and unflinching account. It named Henri Vauclair, not as a vanished planter, but as the perpetrator of an unspeakable crime. It detailed the discovery of the sealed room, the forensic findings of Dr. Prévost, and the chilling contents of Toussaint's letter. Crucially, it named them, Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix, their names in print, in a newspaper, for the first time. It was a small yet monumental act of recognition, a public acknowledgement of their existence, their humanity, and the brutal injustice of their deaths. The article also mentioned the transfer document, the $1 transaction, and the subsequent disappearance of Vauclair himself, hinting at the deeper, darker currents that flowed beneath the surface of the Old South. The article generated little immediate response. The city, still reeling from the yellow fever scare and preoccupied with its own commercial and political machinations, seemed largely indifferent. A few letters to the editor trickled in over the following days, most of them hostile. One, from a reader in Baton Rouge, vehemently defended Vauclair's honor, dismissing the article as slander against the dead and a baseless attack on a respectable family. It spoke of the chaos of the war, the desperation of planters, and implied that such stories were merely fabrications designed to stir up trouble. But then, one letter arrived that stood apart. It was short, handwritten, and signed only as "A Freedman's Daughter, in New Orleans." It said simply, "We have always known." Now at last, someone wrote it down. Arthur read both letters. He read the dismissive one with a sigh, a confirmation of the entrenched resistance to such truths. But the second letter, the anonymous one, resonated deep within him. It was a quiet validation, a profound acknowledgement from someone who understood the unspoken histories, the burdens carried in silence. He carefully cut out the second letter, folded it, and placed it in his personal journal, a small, precious testament to the enduring power of truth, however marginalized. The article, despite its quiet reception, had done its work. It had broken the silence, however briefly. It had etched the names of Toussaint, Adèle, and Felix into the public record alongside the names of the powerful and the privileged. It was not a thunderclap of justice, but a persistent whisper, a seed planted in the fertile yet often resistant soil of public consciousness. And for Arthur Deveau, for Nora Fontenot, and for the memory of Levi Dubose, that was enough. It was a beginning. The winter of 1887 bled into the spring of 1888, and Arthur Deveau, his work at Vauclair finally complete, submitted his comprehensive assessment to Bowyer and Associates. The report, a thick dossier detailing not only the property's value but also the grim history he had unearthed, was received with a mixture of professional acknowledgement and palpable discomfort. The disputed inheritance case, now tainted by the shadow of murder and profound injustice, dragged on for another 4 years, a slow, bureaucratic dance that eventually resolved in favor of a distant Vauclair cousin in Shreveport. This cousin, eager to divest himself of the property's dark legacy, immediately sold the entire estate to a sugar company from Cincinnati. The new owners wasted no time. In 1891, the grand, decaying mansion, the silent witness to so much horror, was systematically demolished. The peeling paint, the collapsed columns, the locked room, and the sealed corridor where Thomas Grier had swung his pickaxe, all were pulled down, reduced to rubble and dust. The ancient cypress trees that had stood sentinel for centuries were cleared, their gnarled roots ripped from the earth. Within a decade, there was no physical trace of Vauclair Plantation. The land, once a landscape of human suffering and architectural grandeur, was transformed into flat, anonymous cane fields stretching endlessly under the Louisiana sun, erasing the past with a relentless green tide. Arthur Devo returned to New Orleans, resuming his work as a land assessor. He was not the same man who had journeyed to Iberville Parish that September. The methodical precision remained, but a quiet gravitas had settled upon him, a profound understanding of the hidden histories that lay beneath the surface of every property he assessed. He did not speak about what he had found there, not often, not easily. The memories were too raw, too heavy, too deeply personal. But the experience had irrevocably altered his perspective, deepening his empathy and sharpening his moral compass. Edgar Tate, however, kept his field journals. The leather-bound books, filled with his youthful, earnest script, became a sacred trust. He kept them carefully, tucked away in a locked trunk, a private archive of a truth that the world had largely chosen to forget. He knew the importance of those pages, the names they held, the story they told. Nora Fontenot continued teaching in Plackham. The article in the Daily Picayune had caused a brief stir, but life in the small town had quickly returned to its familiar rhythms. Yet Nora, with her quiet defiance, added a new, informal unit to her school's curriculum, the history of Iberville Parish. Not the sanitized version found in textbooks, but the real history, the kind that included names like Toussaint, Adele, and Felix alongside the names of the planters and the merchants. Some parents complained, uncomfortable with the uncomfortable truths she presented. But Nora, with her unwavering conviction, taught it anyway, ensuring that a new generation would at least hear the names and perhaps begin to ask the questions. Levi Dubose lived until 1899. He passed away peacefully at approximately 82 years of age, his life a long, quiet testament to resilience and endurance. His obituary in the Plackham paper described him as a long-time resident and former field laborer, a brief, unremarkable notice that captured none of the profound wisdom, the deep memory, or the quiet courage of the man. It did not mention that he was the last living person who remembered Toussaint's face, the last to carry the full, unvarnished truth of the Vauclair plantation in his heart. His passing marked the final fading of living memory, leaving the written word as the sole keeper of the secret. It was 1901, 15 years after the events at Vauclair, and Edgar Tate, now a respected land attorney in Baton Rouge, was preparing to move offices. His youthful enthusiasm had matured into a quiet competence, but the meticulous habits instilled by Arthur Devo remained. As he sorted through old files and forgotten boxes, he came across a heavy leather-bound trunk that had not been opened in years. Inside, nestled amongst other relics of his early career, were his field journals from his time as Arthur's assistant. He pulled them out, the familiar scent of old paper and dried ink wafting up. He began to read, tracing his own handwriting, a younger, slightly breathless version of himself. He reread the entries from September through January of 1887 to 1888, the pages detailing the journey down the Mississippi, the decaying grandeur of Vauclair, the methodical inventory, the chilling words of Levi Dubose. He read his own vivid descriptions of the opening of the wall, the smell of the sealed room, the profound silence that followed the discovery of the bones. He relived the moment he saw the human hand tumble from the darkness, the shock, the horror, the dawning realization of the unspeakable. He found his notes on Dr. Prevost's clinical assessment, the bureaucratic indifference of the parish office, the quiet strength of Nora Fontenot. He reread the transcript of Toussaint's letter, the words still carrying their heartbreaking poignancy, the abrupt, terrifying end. He saw his own questions, his own struggles to comprehend the depths of human cruelty and the systemic injustices that allowed it to flourish. Pressed between two pages, carefully preserved, he found a small, fragile piece of cloth. It was the embroidered cloth from the tin box, the one Arthur had given him after the burial, a tangible link to the lives that had been so brutally extinguished. The embroidery was simple, a single flowering vine, worked in thread that had faded to a near white, with 3 small flowers spaced along its length. He sat with it for a long time, turning it over in his fingers, the delicate fabric a silent testament to a woman's touch, a child's hope, a family's love. The memories, long dormant, surged back with an overwhelming force. The faces of Toussaint, Adele, and Felix, as described by Levi Dubose, now seemed vivid in his mind. The image of Vauclair's slashed portrait, the cold calculation in his painted eyes, the chilling words of Clarence Noel, it all returned as fresh and raw as if it had happened yesterday. That night, Edgar wrote a final entry in the journal. It took him 2 hours, his pen scratching tirelessly across the page, pouring out the accumulated weight of 15 years of silence and reflection. He wrote about what he had seen in that room, the skeletal remains, the poignant objects. He wrote about the letter, Toussaint's voice echoing across the decades. He wrote about Levi Dubose and his profound question, who was there to tell? He wrote about Nora Fontenot, her quiet courage in the face of bureaucratic indifference, her relentless pursuit of official recognition. He wrote about Père Berard, the dignity of the burial, the small, segregated plot of earth. He wrote about the article on page 7 of the Daily Picayune, a whisper against a roar of silence. He wrote, "We found their names. We found what was done to them. We wrote it down. And then the house came down, and the fields grew over it, and the world continued, more or less as it had been. I do not know what to do with that. I have been carrying it for 15 years, and I still do not know. But I am writing it again tonight, in case that matters. In case someone, someday, reads this." Their names were Toussaint, Adele, and Felix. They were real. They were here. And their story, though buried for decades, deserves to be remembered. Not just as a dark chapter, but as a testament to the enduring human spirit that, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, sought to leave a trace, a whisper of truth for those who would eventually listen. This story shows us that the most terrifying thing is not what is buried in the walls. It is the silence that allowed it to happen, and the longer silence that followed. The echoes of Vauclair Plantation remind us that history is not always what is written in grand books, but what is whispered in forgotten corners, and what we choose to remember. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was finally revealed, or do some secrets remain forever buried? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you were captivated by this tale and want more stories like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries and untold histories. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover these vital, chilling narratives. See you in the next one.